Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event with Ambassador Emily Haber of Germany. In my old life, running counterterrorism at the State Department, there were many things that worried me at any given time. In my current life as director of the Dickey Center, there are maybe a few fewer things that worry me. But one of the biggest that worries me is that we would have a distinguished speaker, someone serving currently, come visit Dartmouth, and the hall would be empty. This keeps me awake at night, unlike most other things. I'm delighted you're all here. Thank you so much for coming, especially on a snowy January day. I really appreciate it. Anyway, it's always a great pleasure to have visits from German officials, and we've had a number of them over the years, not only because we share so much in terms of values and interests, but also because Germany is so deeply woven into our history. We think of America as an Anglo-Saxon nation, and for reasons of language and other things, there's a lot of truth to that, but we also have very deep ties to Germany. As more clever high school students know, or should know, more Americans have German ancestry than any other single group, and that's nearly 50 million people. And there's a lot of evidence of our ties around us. Ambassador, you're sitting in a town named for a German city, although we spell it slightly differently, and the people who named it that may have been thinking about the ruling dynasty of the country that they had come from, but nonetheless, it is a German city that it is named for. And in this state, we also have a Berlin and a Franconia. So there's lots of evidence of those ties around. Part of Hanover was once named inexplicably Dresden, and now our school district bears that name, which confuses everyone. It may also surprise you to learn that next door in the very English-sounding town of Norwich, Vermont, where I live, a number of very famous Germans came to live. Among them was Heinrich Brüning, who lived out his retirement here, the last chancellor of Weimar Germany. Perhaps more distinguished and someone the town likes to boast about more is Freya von Moltke, who was the wife of one of the most famous German opponents of Hitler, and also a member of one of Germany's most famous families. And she lived in Norwich with her partner, Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, who was another exile, who was a historian and a philosopher who taught here at Dartmouth. And just to emphasize how close this history is, Freya von Moltke died just 10 years ago this January. Well, it would be great if we could dwell more on this fascinating past. We have a pretty urgent present that beckons to us. As I think most of those who have been involved in transatlantic relations in the last 70 years would agree, America has had no more important bilateral relationship in Europe than it has had with Germany. And indeed, many would argue that the US-German relationship has been the true special relationship in this era. Yet today, our ties are experiencing strains that surpass anything else in the post-World War II period. The American president appears to be no fan of Europe and to reserve a special animus for Germany. He has criticized German defense spending and trade policy frequently, pilloried the Iran nuclear deal that Germany is a signatory and strong supporter of, and created a real rift across the Atlantic. He has repudiated the Paris Climate Accords and achieved notoriety as a climate change denier, something that is horrifying to most Europeans. It would be an understatement to say that he has diverged from the robust multilateral engagement in global affairs that has been the common approach of German and American governments for decades. So it is not an easy time for German policymakers or diplomats. Fortunately for all of us, Germany has sent one of its very best to Washington to manage these challenges. Ambassador Emily Haber has had a truly remarkable career. She has been posted twice to Moscow and has deep expertise on things Russian, and once to Ankara, another one of the West's more troubling relationships these days. She has had a range of high-ranking positions in Germany's foreign ministry, including several dealing with the Balkans and the post-Soviet space. In 2009, she was appointed political director, which is a pivotal position equivalent to our Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and only 2 years later she was made State Secretary, which is essentially the deputy minister and the highest position that a Foreign Service officer can have. From 2014 to 2018, in a very unusual turn of events, she served as State Secretary again, but this time in the Interior Ministry, where she had to deal with the immigration crisis at the height of that event, terrorism, law enforcement, and many other issues. Well, before she did all that, Emily Haber earned a PhD in history and ethnology from the University in Cologne, which of course makes her particularly appealing to a university audience. She wrote her dissertation on German foreign policy during the Morocco crisis, just before World War I. Somehow during this busy career, she found time to marry a fellow diplomat and to raise 2 children. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Haber to Dartmouth. Herzlich willkommen. Are we sitting in the right seats? Have I got that right? Excellent. Okay. Ambassador Haber, I sort of laid the table for your opening statement and colored it as dramatically as possible. But you do have a lot on your plate. You have a president who's been criticizing Germany for taking advantage of the US economically and in security policy. He's threatened on a number of occasions to place tariffs on automobiles. As with much else in the Trump era, we've never seen anything like this from a US president. And how do you, as German ambassador, and how does the German government deal with these challenges? Very diplomatically, I know, to begin with, but I will leave it to you to characterize that.
Well, it's true that there is a pervasive sense, both in the United States and in Europe, in Germany, that the bilateral relationships are under stress. There are quite a number of issues where we disagree. You mentioned some of them. We disagree on burden sharing. We don't disagree, actually. We come from different positions. We disagree on gas transit, Nord Stream 2. We disagree on tariffs. We disagree on the JCPOA, that is the Iranian non-proliferation agreement, and so forth. But the observation is in place that many of these disagreements are actually not new. The other day, someone came to visit me in the residence, and he brought me an article from the Spiegel from the 1980s, which said, Germany is not living up to its burden-sharing commitments. It does not fulfill the 3% goal. So nowadays we're talking about 2%. What I'm saying is it's sometimes necessary not to personalize things, but look at the structure of disagreements and look at the question, are these old, are these new? What are the reasons for the disagreements? And the observation is also in place that we have a lot of experience. Is this unpleasant? Is something wrong?
Keep.
Okay. There's a lot of experience on both sides of the Atlantic to deal with the disagreements and to argue them out. So I don't worry so much about the specific disagreements. What I worry about is, what I worry about more is the fact that we seem to start to look at the international environment through very different prisms. What I mean is this. We see that our geopolitical environment is changing incredibly fast. Look at the re-emergence of Russia as military power. Look at the incredible and precedentless rise of China. look at the consequences of digitization and the development in frontier technologies, if you see all of that, you see that we will enter, to some extent at least, uncharted waters. And as we enter these uncharted waters, we seem to answer questions differently. From many Americans, not from all, but from many Americans, I hear a lot of criticism regarding the international architecture and regarding, well, the architecture of structures, of regional and global governance, of international law, of international agreements. Because many see this architecture as like an albatross hanging around your neck and constraining American interests. Now, it may be that Germans and Europeans are always very much status quo, and we like to see, we probably are less motivated to change things because perhaps we don't see as much, because we're not as strong as you are, and perhaps we don't see the huge advantage of having a powerful ally in changing the environment. But the question remains whether the United States actually wants a reset and a reform of an international environment which has aged over the past decades, or whether you want to go back to square one and restart from scratch. And that's where we have different vantage points. The United States is still the single most powerful country in the world. You are large. And thanks to the sheer power and weight of your country, yes, you can perhaps decide to go it alone, without allies, and questioning the value not only of structures of global governance, but also of allies. A country like Germany cannot. We're not as powerful. We are a medium-sized country in Europe. We are probably one of the most globalized countries in the world, not only because of trade, but also because of trade. 40% of our GDP comes from trade. It's 12% in your case. Tells you something. But I said not only because of trade, simply because we've made, in the last 70 years, the experience that the predictability of structures was our lifeline. We depended on it. It's our experience that our prosperity, our stability, our security, our prowess is connected to the predictability of structures. And we cannot live without it. So if there is a dispute among us, I think that's at the core of it. Having said that, I should also underline that any diplomat from Germany serving in Washington knows this. The United States is the single most important partner that we have outside of the European Union. The most important partner we have outside of the European Union. In terms of security, you mentioned that I served in our what you would call Homeland Security Ministry. Well, I know that we depend on security. We depend on you. We depend on NATO. But I also know that in domestic security, I could attach a number to the number of attacks that have been foiled because of our bilateral cooperation. You name it, in any area, economy, economics, in diplomacy, in security, etc., you are our key partner. And if I would have to name pillars of German foreign policy, well, it would be Europe, it would be the relationship with the United States, and it would be the multilateral environment that we seek to preserve and develop.
Well, thank you for that, and I would only say that, yes, there are those who seem to want to move away from the multilateral system. There are an awful lot of us who think that it works and it should fix it and not ditch it. So I think that is one of the big debates that we will be having in this country in the years ahead. After the G7 several years ago, the G7 summit, Chancellor Merkel said something that was quite striking to me. And that was, she said that the times in which we could completely depend on others are to a certain extent over. I've experienced that in the last few days. We Europeans truly have to take our fate into our own hands. It had been a very ugly summit. I believe that there was not even a summit communique that was signed. And I am curious if you can give us a sense of what this kind of rift has meant to ordinary Germans and to, I think, a continent that did, to a certain extent, expect the United States to take a leading role on the problems of the day.
I don't think a summit is necessarily measured by the fact that it has or does not have a communique. I think this year's, or last year's, G7 summit didn't have a communique.
Yeah, no, they're getting out of the communique habit.
I think that's sometimes a good idea. Anyway, I remember the reaction to her remarks. And it is true that at the time, these remarks were related to the summit. I thought and I continue to think that this is fundamentally wrong. Because again, we seem to personalize something that is essentially structural and has something, but not very much, to do with the United States. I said it at the outset. Our world is fundamentally changing. If you look at the rise of China, well, China has surpassed the United States in power purchase parity terms. It will surpass the United States as economic power, people say, within a decade, possibly, perhaps earlier. The largest economic power in the world will be not a democracy. It is challenging the United States in all frontier technologies. It is investing in the Belt and Road Initiative with the explicit aim to create a factual and virtual infrastructure that will allow it to encourage political behavior or coerce political behavior across the world. I think that's a huge challenge. If we look at our neighborhood, I mentioned the re-emergence of Russia as a military power, altering borders by force, occupying Crimea, conducting an undeclared asymmetric war in Ukraine, interfering in elections and trying to actually influence the most critical infrastructure that we have in our countries, and that is democracy. You could also mention the effects of globalization and by dint of a huge technological revolution which alters, in mobility and communication, would alter the way that countries interact. So all of that is huge. And it will lead, in particular the first and the third aspects I mentioned, it will lead inevitably, to my mind, to the effect that the American focus will not be on Europe, which is one of the most prosperous parts of our world. It will be redirected to the areas where you will be challenged or where you will feel challenged. And that will in turn mean that Europe will have to shoulder greater responsibility. It's not because of disputes we're having, and as I mentioned, some of them are not new. It's because of the balance of the world that is changing, and Europe will have to react to it. And actually it is. You see it within NATO, where it's true, even Germany is not at 2%, but we're moving there. Our defense budget will have grown by 80% in the years between 2014 and 2018. Other countries are following suit. Also, we're trying to reorganize our defense sector. Our defense sector is incredibly fragmented in Europe, and that means it will not be competitive. We'll have to strengthen our home base. It's something that America will need, NATO needs, and actually Europe needs too. It's because of the environment. It's not because of a bilateral relationship.
Well, I think your memos are reaching very high in the German government, because the Chancellor, I think, said yesterday in a Financial Times interview that she too had moved on from thinking that it was about personalities and that it was structural.
It's always good if the Chancellor says something that the Ambassador says too.
So you mentioned China, and it's the German-Chinese relationship was on the front page of today's New York Times, with Germany is, like the United States, very concerned about Huawei, the Chinese telecom company that many fear enables Chinese spying. And China has responded by threatening automobile imports. And I look at this and I have to wonder if we as the West haven't missed a big opportunity to deal with this extraordinary phenomenon, the rise of China, more collaboratively. I'm curious whether you would agree with that.
Yes and no. I think it's not really on the public radar that we are in very close in a very close working relationship with you with regard to China on a number of aspects. Certainly market access, the enforced joint venture obligations, intellectual property thefts, all these structural aspects that have led China to exploit the international environment for their own benefit. So we're talking about that. I would say that whereas the United States sees China very much through a geopolitical lens, which I would do too, our view is slightly different insofar as we do see that China is a systemic rival, insofar as it pursues different governance aims. But it's not only that. It's a competitor. It's a competitor as far as Germany is concerned in all areas where it tries to replace us in fields where we are market leaders, which is an important part of the 2025 strategy that it has set forth. But it's also a partner. Not a partner necessarily because we want to, but because global issues such as climate change or standards for frontier technologies, etc., we cannot negotiate that without China, so we'll have to talk with them. Also, in some areas, China does play a role that we welcome, such as in international peacekeeping missions. So China is a systemic rival, it's a competitive, and in some areas a partner. I do observe one difference in the discussions, and I'll come to Huawei in a minute because I didn't mention that among the areas of differences, which perhaps you have noted before. I thought for a minute perhaps I should, but I will explain to you why I didn't. I hear every now and then people in the United States, but I also hear it from Chinese, saying that in the long run we need decoupling. That's not how Europeans would see it. We believe that the costs of decoupling basically means deglobalization, or a separation into or more global separate universes, and that would come at huge costs. Economic costs certainly, but even more political costs. Think of what decoupling might mean for countries like Korea or for Japan, where not only the economic issues would come to mind, but also Chinese intention to use power and the proximity of geography in order to coerce a certain behavior. I think we would be in for a very dangerous world should decoupling in effect be the desired end state. And now on Huawei, I hear, or at least I heard, it sort of as Nova center stage, a lot of criticism at times. And I do understand the criticism if, in effect, your analysis were right. I think it's hugely important if a country like China, as I said, in future the largest economy in the world, in all likelihood, if not something doesn't happen, and a country that would dominate the world's most important infrastructure of the future, and that is the communication systems. Well, that's huge. I do see the point. But I do not think that people realize here that we do not come from so different vantage points. It's true. My government is not prepared to say we're going to exclude providers in deciding on the 5G system. But we're saying this. We will only allow providers to offer their bid if they fulfill required criteria. And among the criteria figures the trustworthiness of a provider, which of course is linked to the question, is that a state economy? Is it a state economy that is pursuing an agenda which is colored politically? And if that is the case, it will have an impact on a government's decision whether this provider can be included. So you see, you can choose different paths. You can choose the path to say we want a specific exclusion of possibilities, or you can take the decision that you will take a generic decision which will be predicated on the desired end state, which in turn depends on security requirements.
Why don't we talk about the things that have been at the very top of the news lately, namely the Iran and the U.S. strike that killed General Qasem Soleimani. So one would not be surprised to hear that those who are still supportive of the JCPOA, of the Iran nuclear deal, would view this as destabilizing, as possibly putting a nail in the coffin of the agreement, and that this actually would be a matter for great disagreement across the Atlantic. And not only because of the JCPOA, but also because of the question of the legality of the strike, which is increasingly being debated among Americans as well. How does Germany look at this rather extraordinary episode in international relations?
Well, first I would say this: the man was a terrorist. And it is well known that he has declared war on America. the administration has made the point that it has acted in self-defense, and self-defense in terms of international law is in conformity with the requirements of international law. The administration has presented its case in Congress. I cannot comment further on this simply because I do not know the details of the specific reasons and expectations that the administration has pointed to when explaining its case. Now, moving to the JCPOA, we've always regretted that the United States has withdrawn from the JCPOA, but the latest attacks on the JCPOA, one must say, came from Iran. Iran, ever since summer last year, has taken a number of decisions that were in absolute non-compliance with the JCPOA. It has reneged on the ceilings for enrichment. It has reneged on, do you say renege?
Renege.
Renege. It has reneged?
Yes, correct.
Oh, really? It sounds wrong to me. Anyway.
I think we got it from the French somehow. I don't know.
Okay, it has reneged on on research, on the research obligations, on not using a FODO, and in the latest step, it has reneged on the ceiling for centrifuges. So this was serious, and that is why for about 2 weeks we've had discussions internally about the triggering of the dispute resolution mechanism under Article 36 of the JCPOA. We have taken the decision. We've taken the decision because of what Iran did and what we found unacceptable. We're not withdrawing from the JCPOA. Actually, we want to preserve the JCPOA, and we want Iran to return to compliance. We're doing exactly what the dispute resolution mechanism does, and that is trying to tackle issues at stake and try to remedy a dispute with the explicit intention to restore compliance. Now, the E3 leaders, and that is France, Great Britain, and Germany, last Sunday have issued a statement. They have said we will never accept a nuclear Iran. They have also said that we want further negotiations on the future of the Iranian nuclear program. But we want to do this not by withdrawing or destroying an agreement, which we think would be wrong. If you destroy something, you have nothing in place instead as an alternative, which would allow you to tackle disputes, I think you're worse off. And we do have a non-proliferation agreement with Iran, which is the JCPOA. So we want to use the JCPOA as a starting point. We want to, for further negotiations, we want to use the the dispute resolution mechanism in order to return to compliance. We're not going to join the maximum pressure strategy, and we continue to believe that the JCPOA, it has flaws. Every agreement has flaws. That's the lesson of diplomacy, because every agreement usually is a compromise, and that means you don't get what you want, at least not 100%. It has flaws, and they will have to be addressed. Now, let me tell you this. I was part of the Iran negotiations until 2012. And I do remember from the negotiations that at the time it was Iran that said, "Oh, we want a bigger negotiation. We want a negotiation on regional that will include regional issues." And it was us who said, We want the focus on the real stuff, and that is your nuclear program, because that is really the biggest danger in the region, and we want you to focus on that and not dilute the issue and water down what is really important. Having said that, I would also add this. If you have differences, it's worthwhile looking whether you have differences on strategy or difference on tactics. It's important in the Iranian context. Because in the Iranian context, you will see that on strategy, we're really pretty much aligned. Because we agree that the sunset clauses of the agreement now with a lapse of time have become a problem. We do think that Iran's regional behavior is a huge problem. We do think that the missile issue are a problem. And all of that will have to be dealt with. The difference that we have is, can we deal with it? Is it better to deal with it by withdrawing from the agreement, dropping it, having nothing, and restarting from scratch? Or is it better to seek a new consensus on the basis of the constraints that this agreement provides? And our answer is the latter.
Well, I'm in the difficult position of being extremely sympathetic to the position of America's allies on this, but also having a lot of understanding for Iranian frustration. They signed on to an agreement that was supposed to provide for an exchange. They would suspend their nuclear program, they would get access to the world economy. We reneged. And we are strangling their economy. So it's very difficult to see what interest they would have in sticking with this accord when we've pulled the rug out from under them. It's a terrible regime, and I spent years working to check the malign behavior of Qasem Soleimani. From an Archimedean point in the universe, it's hard for me to see how we are going to get where we want to be given the approach that we have taken. And I feel like we, the United States, have left our allies and co-signatories going down with the ship.
Well, I would agree that Iran's behavior within the agreement has deteriorated, by which I mean it started its non-compliance after the withdrawal of the United States from the agreement, and after seeing that as a consequence of American sanctions, there would be very little benefit for Iran from the agreement, which it had expected. I would say that is true, but I would also point to the fact that after concluding the agreement, when most of the partners to the agreement would have expected that in the long run Iran's behavior would alter because it would have returned to, shall we say, from a pariah status to the international community, to interaction with the Western community, I should say. And that has not, Iran has certainly done things which are difficult to define as in good faith. Their activities in Syria, their behavior in Syria, the development of the missile program, I do understand those who argue that they have felt that the JCPOA has given them a certain cover to proceed that way. I don't agree with it, but it can be read that way, and it's certainly true that Iran, at no stage after concluding the agreement, tried to dispel that impression.
So let me ask you two more questions. We could go on for a long time, but I want to open it up to the audience. The first one is about a country that you know very well, Russia. As you mentioned early on, Russia is sowing dissent within Western democracies. It is sowing dissent between Western democracies. It has broken the fundamental rule of the post-war settlement, which is no changing of borders by force. And yet, a country with a poor and declining economy and terrible demographics seems to be outplaying all of us right now. As a Russia hand, what should we be doing?
First of all, we need to understand why they're doing it. The first reason is they want to preserve, this president certainly wants to preserve the system. And they've seen the story of the colored revolutions in the post-Soviet realm, and they've taken in the lesson. The second thing is they want to restore a multilateral system in which they are one of the centers. And both objectives are interlinked. Now, they know perfectly well that both NATO and EU are so much stronger, and it's very difficult to confront them. And this is what leads them to choose tactics and strategies that will balance off the fact that they're again a military power, as I said, but they're not nearly as. Someone the other day said, if you want to compare Russia and China in climate categories, you would call China climate change and Russia a tempest. So that gives you a bit the proportions. So if that is the case, then asymmetric tactics are their preferred strategy, are their preferred options. By asymmetric tactics, I mean an undeclared war, escalation where they are pretty certain that they will have escalation dominance, which we've seen in Ukraine and in Crimea, the interference in democratic processes, the sometimes blatantly visible playing of public discontent. I don't know whether you are familiar with a case that was called the Lisa case in Germany. This was in 2015, actually at the height of the migration crisis, when there was a lot of, probably end of 2015, when there was a lot of people were started to get very worried, and there was a lot of discontent. And then suddenly there was this case of, alleged case of a young girl of Russian-German descent that claimed she had been raped by two Muslim immigrants. Turned out the day after it was wrong. It was invented. She hadn't returned home because she was worried because she had had a bad report card in school. She had invented it. She had stayed with friends overnight. But at the same time, this was clear. The Federal Crime Office identified it and made it public, etc. But at the same time, 20 demonstrations in German towns, more or less at the same time, was beautifully choreographed. I observed it at the time. Involving right-wing people, involving worried Russian Germans, which is the largest individual community in Germany. People don't know that, but it's true. They're Germans, but they're Russian descent, and they're very well organized. Anyway, this was it was completely fabricated. It was invented, and 4 days afterwards, when it was clear, the Russian foreign minister in a press conference with the German foreign minister mentions the case as a reason to worry for Russia because German Russians are no more safe. So this is what's happening, but it's a blatant case of not interference, but of sowing discontent with a political agenda and a political objective. And that's what we're seeing. So what we're doing about it, what we all should be doing about it, the first is unity. within the EU, obviously, but also in NATO and in the transatlantic context. And I say this because sanctions have become a preferred instrument of American foreign policy. Now, mind you, I think sanctions are a necessary instrument. It's the strongest form of diplomatic language, and foreign policy needs this instrument. But if you see a proliferation of the use of the instrument, and if you use it without having partners on board, then you start on a downhill road at the end of which the instrument will not work anymore. So, unity. The second is we need, of course, in military terms, deterrence, but we also need dialogue. We need both. Just as sanctions shouldn't be punitive, they can be. But if there's no incentive for future behavior, then those who are being sanctioned will read the instrument in different terms than they will if they know at the end of the day they can come out of it. It's not only about punishing the past, it's about changing the future and offering an off-ramp for a different sort of cooperation. So dialogue and deterrence, and as far as interference is concerned, resilience. You see, one of the effects of the Lisa case was that this became so public. Everyone sort of knows this acronym, that people started to in these. Okay, and I'll start differently. If cases of this sort start, or if you have a false story out there, it is hugely important that it's not the content of the false story that is making the headlines, but the origins of the false story. You cannot, even false stories, they cannot be, they will not die. You cannot prevent them. But if they're being published, publishers or newspapers or we're all nowadays active parts of in the communication society. The story must be, where does it come from and what's the intention? And then the rest, the content can come. So that's part of the resilience that is so necessary. And we should help others in acquiring that resilience.
So to follow up, because of your experience at the Interior Ministry, specifically on Russia, we have a very bizarre development in history. We had complete separation of spheres in the Cold War. And at least my takeaway from what we have seen in this country in the last few years is that the oligarchs and international organized crime, which the Russians play a very large role in, represent a remarkable threat to the integrity of our systems because of the opportunity for corruption, influence, and the like. And yet, in part because of the reigning views in the United States, I don't get the sense that this is really on the agenda as a matter for Western action. Can you tell us how you view this problem and whether you think, at least among European powers, this is something that has attracted attention and is going to get a response?
I don't know. I don't quite understand what the intention of the question is. There are a number of sanctions that have been adopted in the context of the Crimea invasion, of the Kerch developments, of eastern Ukraine, where also oligarchs have been targeted. The point of departure was not corruption. The point of departure was the fact that you cannot draw a clear line of division between state entities and economic entities. But this is not the direction of your question, is it?
No, I'm looking at our what is going on in our impeachment process and seeing that Russian money, often dirty, is infiltrating our system, is permeating our system and causing a level of disruption and corruption that we are hard-pressed to deal with using the authorities that we ordinarily dispense, and perhaps because it just hasn't been high enough on the agenda. I remember years ago having a conversation with a colleague from the intelligence community and saying, what's a bigger threat, terrorism or international organized crime? And she said, international organized crime. It's just corroding the international economy, it's corroding politics, and we don't seem to have identified it as the problem that it is, but perhaps you disagree.
No, I don't.
I mean, it's hard to compare terrorism and corruption.
Yeah.
Let's stipulate that.
Well, nowadays nearly all crime is international crime. I checked on my previous job in Germany, I noticed that over 70% of all crimes committed had international contexts. So crime is like climate.
Right.
It doesn't stop at borders anymore, especially not in the virtual world. And believe me, it may not be so much on the political radar, but those who are dealing with it are operating hand in glove because they realize that they can only tackle it together.
I have many more questions. I'll ask one and then I'll open it up to the audience. Popular nationalism is the cry of the day. Those of us who have spent lots of time in Germany came to believe, I think, in the 80s, 90s, early part of this century, that Germany probably had more immunity from it than most countries because of its historical experience. It seems to be a global virus, and in Germany it has now taken the form of the Alternative für Deutschland, which has at least so far appeared to be a pretty potent political movement. Do you think that it is a movement in Germany that has legs, that is going to endure? And if so, what should we all be doing about this global problem?
It's a phenomenon that is worldwide. That's my first point. But even though it's worldwide, the reasons and the motives that fuel the movements are very different. In Germany, it's not really income gaps. That's not, it is in the UK, for example. It may be here, I think, to some extent. It may be, but it's not in Germany. In Germany, it's different. The first Eurosceptic movement or populist movement started in the context of the Euro crisis, and it was a limited movement, and they really didn't make it into parliament. This changed with the migration crisis in 2015. And what I witnessed at the time was this. There was a disconnect between what was actually happening and what people felt about it. Worry, concern, fear, what does it mean for my children, how will the society alter, and so forth. And between what the government said they could do about it. And the government would point to, yes, it will take time, we'll have to negotiate with Turkey, we'll have to alter laws, but even then there's European law, and etc. So this disconnect made people say, hey, but we vote for a government and we haven't asked for this, and now you are pointing to international conditions or regional governance conditions, but we are voting within borders and we're voting for a national government and we're holding you accountable. So I'm saying that in very simple terms, but this is what I observed at the time. And the phenomenon behind it is to be taken very seriously, and that is that globalization has ring-fenced the national sovereignty and the capacity to solve problems on a national basis. That's a fact. And we'll have to deal with it. Now, what people, it's very difficult to explain, actually, that in our globalized world, regional governance institutions such as the European Union is actually there to safeguard people from the effects of globalization. But that's a very difficult story that we need to get out there. But if we won't manage to explain that, because globalization itself will not be disinvented, and it's true that people need protection from the jungle effects of it, and that's why, as borders are not really relevant for global phenomena, you need interaction, and you need negotiations, and you need agreements, and you need compromises on them. So, but in Germany there's a second phenomenon, and that is specific to Germany, and that is the AfD is especially strong in the eastern federal states, that is in the states of the former GDR, where the population has gone in the last 30 years through a huge transformation. And now they felt that a second transformation revolution was going to confront them. And the effect of the success of the AfD can only be understood if you see it in that context. It is being placed, you see, I remember the demonstrations in 2015, especially in Eastern Germany, when people shouted, "Why don't you first integrate us?" And it made me understand that this was also about a collective sense of respect for biographies that they felt was not sufficient or visible or palpable for them and for their identities. So it's also identity related in Germany in a very specific context, which in turn will tell you it's probably not something that will play a role in the longer run. But for now, and the AfD is only hovering nationwide around 10 or 12%, sometimes 50%, but it's not on the rise.
So you think that by sort of natural increase with the changing of generations that will...
Yes.
Okay. So I believe there are microphones walking around with people. Yes, there's one back there. And there's one, is that a question, Ellis, or is that a hand, or is that a microphone? Please wait for the microphone so that you can be recorded for posterity. And please make sure there's a question mark at the end of your question. And that will be great. So, do we have hands? How about right down here, far away from where the microphone is? There goes Taylor. She's running there. Okay. Hi. Professor Schuckman.
Is this working now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if I could follow up on Dan's question and maybe rephrase part of what I think he was asking, or might have been asking, and that's this. You mentioned earlier in your talk that China would soon be the world's largest economy without also being a democracy. And I wonder if that, combined with the fact that the extremes of American populism lately have cast doubt on democracy, makes Germans also doubt democracy as a whole? Or is there something specific in your experience, in your national experience of coming by democracy the hard way, that makes you more resilient and might help us out of this place?
So the question was, and Ellis, correct me if I've gotten it wrong, that you mentioned that China was going to be the largest economy without being the largest democracy. Do you think that democracy has something that, am I correct in saying, that carries with it resilience in the face of challenges like that? Is that the appropriate way to phrase it?
I guess what I wondered was whether there was not just the economic argument, but also other arguments that danger that would lead us to conclude that democracy itself is in danger. And I wonder if there were anything about the German experience, or German government structures, lack of an electoral college, for example, that might help us cope with this problem, which is not a problem confined to the United States, but which has taken surprisingly alarming forms here.
Do you think democracy is endangered currently? And does Germany have any particular lessons for the United States right now?
I think that we can take nothing for granted. Yes, that I would say. And I believe that in this country and in Europe, generations have grown up that are so accustomed to democracy that they do not realize that things can turn out. When the chancellor was in Harvard, she gave a speech, and this was last summer, and she said how she, as a young woman, she lived near the border in East Berlin, and she had to go on her way home always towards the border and turn left, and she always had the feeling of turning away from freedom. And it was very visible to her that this was something that didn't exist. And she said to the young people there, I had never imagined that the wall could one day not be there. And I wish that young people, students, realize the fact that you too cannot take for granted what we have today. And in our communication societies where everyone can produce information, right and false, and every information, right or false, can have the same credibility and value and respectability, I think that is truly a threat to democracy, to the core of democracy. And whether we have lessons, no, I don't have any lessons from Germany. I think we're in it together, all of us, in democracies.
Is it on?
Thank you so much for coming to visit us and for speaking to us. So just before the Thanksgiving holiday, the Pew Research Center, in conjunction with the Körber Stiftung, published, results of a massive poll against the backdrop of NATO's 70th anniversary and meetings, in London commemorating that. And despite Trump's rhetoric, about 2/3 of Americans viewed our relationship with Germany positively and its course positively as well. About that same proportion of Germans actually viewed that relationship negatively and hoped for closer cooperation with Russia. The poll investigated some of the causes. They said Iraq war, continued American troop presence. Do you think that maybe a more visible demonstration of other sorts of bilateral cooperation, development work in Africa, disease prevention, research partnerships, cultural exchanges, do you think that might go some way towards showcasing our relationship in the best light going forward, creating some of this, building some of this the goodwill that we'll need to tackle more serious global issues? And what sort of programs, could we support?
Okay, now first on the poll. The poll worried me a great deal because, for obvious reasons, there is a worrying, deeply worrying, alarming gap between the perception of the United States in Germany and the perception of Germany here, and actually one will affect the other possibly. So we need to worry about that. Then I looked at the history of the poll and at previous polls and at other European polls, because the Körber Stiftung and Pew didn't only investigate the reactions in Germany, but in a number of European states, not all of them. And what I saw was this. First, Germany was an outlier, which is good news for the United States because it means that the perception of the United States in other European countries is not like in Germany. In Germany, France, Finland, a number of states that are pretty much aligned, but still Germany is an outlier. Second point, and that is much more important, we seem to be extremely abrupt in our perceptions of the United States. And we've seen a similar movement and equally abrupt during President Bush, George W. Bush period, where it went starkly down for a couple of years, and it altered completely in 2000, what was it, 9?
9.
Mm-hmm. So, and the same movement, exactly the same movement, with a small exception of 2014 when we had the NSA disclosures. But overall, the picture is always the same. It's very abrupt, it's very personalized, and it is correctable. Yeah, so it's not structural. I'm saying to you, it's not something you can necessarily extrapolate. Whether we seem a very stable nation in our perceptions, I don't know, but it's not structural. My second point is, and I'll tell you another story. This was in 1989. I had just returned from the Soviet Union. I was on a holiday in Bonn, then the capital of Germany, and Gorbachev had come to visit Germany. I just had returned to the Soviet desk, but was on a holiday during that time. And the streets were lined, not only in Bonn, but across Germany. People were, it was eerie actually, were hailing him as the rescuer of I don't know what, and there was incredibly much hope and expectation linked to it. And if you observed these masses who greeted him, you would have thought, where is the German-Soviet relationship going to be? It will be completely different in 2 to 3 years. And as you know, this did not happen. And I only realized when I arrived in the United States, why not? Because I realized it here because we have something that did not exist at the time with regard to the Soviet Union. We have an incredibly intense fabric of relations and bonds and contacts that are in place, no matter if we disagree on Nord Stream or Iran. And that is what you mentioned, actually, university exchange, student exchanges, city partnerships, the number of GIs that have done a tour of service in Germany, 17 million all in all, which means they have brothers and sisters and sons and daughters, etc. There are so many exchange programs, you wouldn't be able to name them all, and for me that's the most important part of the relationship actually. People that have been to the United States or in Germany that bring home personal human experience, It's just experience of one another and of what makes us tick and what's important to us and why we may worry about different things. Last year we had organized a very large, well, sometimes we called it a cultural program, but it was much more than a cultural program. It was also sort of a public relations campaign. And the idea was, yes, we have an infrastructure and architecture of bonds in place. There are incredibly many people who are interested in one another and will stay so even if there are political disputes. But how can we make sure that new people take an interest in one another? And we organized events in all 50 states. Actually, we in the virtual field, we reached 11 million people, which is a lot. We took a specific focus in the Middle West because we felt in the large cities at the coasts we had very close contacts, but we needed more. And we felt it was a big success insofar as we got people together taking an interest. I always feel the United States should do the same in Europe and in Germany, because it's, at the end of the day, That's what I learned on that day in 1989, or reflecting on it years later. At the end of the day, what counts are human contacts.
Okay. Student hands. Let's see them. How about over here?
It was perfect time. It was perfect timing to bring up exchange. Because that was my question. With the risk of sounding like a joke, if we could have an exchange between people in the German and the American healthcare systems, what lessons would you imagine we could teach each other?
As you know, we have very different healthcare systems. We do have very good contacts actually on healthcare. We don't have any exchanges on healthcare systems, on the healthcare system, and we are on different planets there. Yeah, we could demonstrate the merits of our system, which is a thoroughly organized one, and one that people here tell me they feel is socialist, but it provides for a lot of security and a lot of transparency. And on the other hand, people in Germany might learn here the merit of a huge capacity for innovation.
Did you have a question?
Thank you, Ambassador Haber. So my question is that last month,
Closer.
correct me if I were wrong. Last month, Russia and Germany signed an agreement to continue building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from St. Petersburg to Germany, and firms, Russian and German alike, were punished for it by the United States. Does Germany see this kind of action from a close ally as a sign that in today's world, Germany has always been a multilateral player on the international stage, now has to make a choice between its main energy provider and its closest ally?
The Nord Stream dispute is one of the disputes that is old. Nord Stream 1 has been criticized as Nord Stream 2 has been criticized. And in all fairness, it has been criticized in a bipartisan way. When I go to Congress, there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats when they raise the Nord Stream issue. Now, it's true, end of December, Nord Stream 2 has been targeted with sanctions by PESA, which is the relevant sanction act. My country has regretted that. Now, you see, you need to understand this. There was reason for the criticism against Nord Stream 1, which I always understood, or even Nord Stream 2. Because during the Georgian War, for example, in 2008, Russia showed that it was ready to weaponize gas and energy deliveries. Or think of 2011, when Russia also weaponized the gas transit via the Ukraine, and half of southeastern Europe was freezing. So I call this hostage taking for political reasons, and that's not acceptable. So if you criticize, Russia has never done that to Germany, obviously, because we have been in the context much too important partners, but they've targeted other European partners, so that's something that Germany cannot ignore. We have taken the conclusions in 2011, and we have reconstructed the pipeline system. Nowadays, you can pump gas into any direction you can, east, west, south, north, etc., which means that energy security cannot be defined anymore by the question, where does the gas come from, but can you actually replace a provider should the provider should the provider weaponize the delivery. That can't happen anymore. Also, we did see the argument that the transit via the Ukraine or the lack of transit via the Ukraine would give Russia space to pull its weight with regard to the Ukraine. And as Ukraine is a close partner of ours, we felt this needed to be addressed, and we did. The agreement that has been signed end of December is not an agreement with regard to Nord Stream. It's a Russian-Ukrainian gas transit agreement which wouldn't have been negotiated without the crucial role that Germany played. The European Union played a role, but it wouldn't have come about without my country. Now gas transit via the Ukraine is guaranteed for the next 5 years, which means that, again, we've been able to limit Russian space for malign activities in the, or that's the wrong wording, for exploiting Ukrainian weakness. And that's why we felt disappointed when the steps we've actually taken in order to address legitimate concerns had not been factored in. It's true, we're an ally, and we're a close ally, and we're a loyal ally. And we worry about the effects that targeting an ally will have in the conversation in Germany about the alliance.
Okay, how about right there? Had his hand up quickly.
Thank you for being here with us today. And my question is, you said that Russia and China are the systematic rivals of the democratic countries, and but economic sanctions or military deterrence could only change their behaviors temporarily for like months or a year. But this fundamental divergence in this ideology will never change. So what do you think is the ultimate solution to this systematic rivalry?
I don't think I framed it the way you put it, and my answer is a very short one. Be attractive, normative clout. And that means functioning democracies that are prosperous, transparent, and demonstrate what it can mean to people if they have choices.
Okay, right here.
Thank you, ma'am, for coming. You've mentioned several times personalized problems versus structural problems. Are there any personal problems that you see as changing kind of the structural factors that aren't fleeting, that, you know, don't return to some structural baseline after the personality has left?
It's sort of a good abstraction.
You really pose challenges for diplomats, you know. Personalities matter. They always matter in diplomacy and elsewhere and in history. That's obvious. But I will nonetheless turn to the structural aspect of the question you have posed. If you take decisions, some decisions can be rescinded. Do I pronounce that correctly?
Rescinded.
Rescinded. Some of the decisions can be rescinded. You can easily decide whether you want to return into the Paris Climate Agreement or not. Some decisions are not easily rescinded. You will not return a capital to the previous the embassy to a previous place, because you don't. It's always easier to make the case for staying in a flawed international organization, such as the Human Rights Council, than to make the case to return into a flawed international organization that you've left. So you see, I'm trying to explain to you that decisions matter, and some decisions will stay. And that is independent of even of structural changes. So basically, yes, there are always developments and always changes. We must live with it. What is important, I think, what the crucial question at the end of the day is, do we think that in this complicated world of ours, we need allies and alliances and like-minded, and is it worthwhile investing into it? I once read, this was a while ago, that America had 67 allies, allied agreements or so. So 67, that's huge, because it is also about projecting power and leveraging alliances. If that's important, the effect is obvious. If you start to question the worth of, or the value of allies or like-minded partners, then the effect will be huge. Perhaps in the beginning less for you because of your clout, but in the long run, this calculus will only be true in bilateral situations. You see, in any bilateral situation, the partner with more power will prevail, will have the better deals, will determine the direction. But no country is ever only in bilateral situations.
Do you think Turkey is still reliable, and do they still belong in NATO?
Reliable and belong in NATO.
An American colleague, one of the most formidable diplomats of your diplomatic service, a bit older than I am, once said to me, he remembered Turkey from the 1980s. And at no time, he said, at no time has Turkey been an easy partner. When he spoke about the Turkey of the 1980s, mind you, he spoke about Turkey, the Turkey of Kenan Evren, and that is that was at the time of the after the military coup and the military dictatorship. So Turkey has always been a very complex partner, a very complicated partner. What has changed is Turkey's environment, but also over the last decade, we've seen Turkey's expectation on its own role in the region implode too. We shall see how the latest turn of events with regard to Libya plays out. But certainly to deal with Turkey as a partner of Europe and as a partner within the transatlantic alliance is a challenge.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. My question is on human rights. Recently, there has been increasing instances of China weaponizing its economic ties with other countries to force them to give up their, giving up their constant calling outs of its human rights abuse. Recently, you have seen that since the Nobel Prize was awarded to a famous Chinese descendant, China has banned a lot of imports from Norway and significantly damaged its agricultural sector. So I'm just wondering, with the increasing economic independence, interdependence between China and members of the EU, what should a proper response for countries like Germany be? Like when other similar human rights abuses emerges in other parts of China?
Frankly, you return me to my point of departure of today's discussion, and that is this. It is true, when mentioning human rights abuses or weaponizing instruments in order to prevent countries from raising these issues, that happens. How can we respond to it? Well, I would make the case that if we stand up for our collective values, for an international system and an international order which has basically been developed under American leadership and at a time when America was at the apex of its power, when an international order that to some extent was to emulate how America saw herself, right? If you question that order, you give license, the international order. If you question that order and the standards and the norms that are linked with it, even if much of it is flawed, you give license to those who never liked that order, because their ideas of governance were not reflected in it, or because they had stood at the sidelines when this order had evolved over the past decades. You give license to them, you give license to autocrats, and you define their own potential for power projection.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question. Do we have one final question? I have a student. I'm looking. Oh, I couldn't see your hand behind that other student's head. Thank you very much. Yes, right there.
Hello, so I'm not a student, but I'm very happy that you're here, and actually your visit inspired us to organize a lecture series which we call Wende Now, and it is on shifting borders. And of course you are the expert here. And on the other hand, it's also just migration. And you were the state secretary during the so-called immigration crisis, the summer of immigration, the refugee crisis in 2015. And I wonder if you could dare to share your insights with us. First of all, do you agree with Angela Merkel, wir schaffen das? Can we really manage that? And what do you think about integration and the role of Germany within Fortress Europe and the Frontex system and the disappearance of migrants who try to enter Fortress Europe? And on the other hand, would you dare to compare the different vantage points? And I like that very much in your speech, that you really focused on the different structures and vantage points. Would you dare to compare the perspectives of the United States and Europe and Germany?
This is not one question. These are many. The first part of your question is, wir schaffen das, actually it's not we manage it, it's much more. And the moment it was said, this was in summer, in August 2015, shortly before the crisis really peaked, it was meant to reassure Germans that yes, there was a big thing underway, but we were a country with a highly skilled administration and a hugely motivated population that actually was ready to receive people. At the time, you see, the public feeling was still very positive, and that a modern country like mine, with its highly capable administration and on all layers of government, from local government to the federal government, that we would be able to manage it. And this was true. Actually, I'm still proud of what we did at the time. There were no people who were homeless at no stage. Every day, think of it, we had 10,000, 12,000 coming every day. And I think at the time I worked 20 hours a day because the goal was we had to move them across Germany, make sure they would have a bed in the evening, that they had the food and the benefits that they were required to have. And we managed it. But what we did not manage, and what will take more time, is the aspect of transformation. You see, every migration is related to identity, identity of those who come and identity of those who receive them, and both will alter. And that's my lesson. That's always difficult, and you cannot enforce it. Not in democracies. In democracies, you have to respect if people are uneasy about something, and you cannot talk them out of it. You need to respect it, and you need to respect all sides there. And this is a difficult conversation, and it will take some time. It was a very difficult process. Now you asked me to compare. It was a very difficult process to, and our goal was also to limit immigration, because it was obvious you can 10,000, 12,000 every day for a country like Germany. In the longer run, this was not sustainable. And you have to accept that open borders, yes, if you decide you want them, you have to accept too that the society you live in at the end of the day will be fundamentally different. And you have to be ready for that if you call for open borders. I don't. I don't, because I accept that migration in a democratic society rests on a very difficult equation that will have to factor in very different interests. And democracy is about the equation of interests of the people who live in a society. We'll have to accept that. And it was always difficult for me to accept or to see that when people talked about migration, they were like in separate universes. Universe A would say, but we need migration because of demography and our economy needs it. Universe B would say, we have to do it for moral reasons and let everyone come. And Universe C said, yes, but what does it mean for our neighborhood, and how will women be respected as they used to be, and what about different religion, and what about our historical legacy with regard to Israel? You see, these are all legitimate questions, and you have to respect every single them. In our societies, we have to argue that out, and that takes time, and it's not easy, and it comes with fits and starts. But if we are grown-ups, we need to accept it.
Well, that's a great place to stop. Ambassador Haber for a fantastic conversation, wide-ranging, and ultimately, I would say, reassuring and encouraging that despite all those personal and structural issues that we have people of good faith and great intelligence working on them. So thank you very much.